All right, good day, folks. Welcome to Reconcile. We have a really rich dialogue that's about to take place here. Um, and you know what? I'm not even going to plant seeds right now. Sounds maybe unfair. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open the space to um, invite my guests here to briefly introduce themselves. And then from there, it's going to unfold in an organic, natural way. Maybe I'll give you a little spoiler, but we're talking about some really important topics when it comes to um, not only human well-being, health, but transformation and consciousness transformation and the values that underlie how we orient in the world and kinds of practices and things to engage in that would support a movement towards, let's call it reconciliation, or a movement towards yoga, union of the separate self with the whole totality of the universe. So I'll leave it at that for now. These unique gentlemen. I'm going to open the floor here. Why don't you get us started here, Rajive, Dr. Jassal?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm Rajive Jassal, one of the neurologists in Edmonton, Alberta. And John and I met through yoga, and we continue to do great work together. And I'm looking forward to this conversation that we're going to have. And I always appreciate John's word of rich because the conversation is indeed rich. And thanks for having me again.
Mhm. Thanks so much for being here. Rameen.
Hello. Well, wonderful to be here. My name is Rameen Peyrow. Uh, you asked to give a brief introduction to who I am and why I'm here. So it would only be fair to start at the beginning and to honor the fact that I came from two parents that were very interested in the focused study of meditation, and their seed was planted. And on a very, very simple piece of instruction, uh, my practice began, my look into this wonderful, very rich, as you referred to, yoga, with a simple piece of information and a request of my father for me, whenever I had a thought, to place my thought on a cloud and watch it float away. And within that moment, I had an opportunity to see what was between me and that cloud. And what began to transpire from that quality of space has become everything. Fast forward, I took a strong interest into the physical postures at 17 and started in classical hatha yoga. Fast forward again, 21 years old, I'm very now keen in traveling to India and studying with a profound master, Sri K. Pattabhi Jois, who I'm very honored to have spent time with, which then set me on the path of developing the understanding of what is Ashtanga Yoga. And fast forwarding again now, 2003, starting a yoga center, and for the next 20 years, running the Yoga Loft and the Sattva School of Yoga. How I met both of you, and in around 2014, looking at online as being an opportunity to develop stronger connections with people who are not able to physically be in a one location with us, and is presently now the science of self, and even more present, looking at broadening my explanation of yoga into a embodiment series called Somatic Living, and showcasing a very specific level of the work that has been put together over the past 20 years called the Foundational Series, and offering an opportunity for people to systematically open up their bodies, starting with the feet and legs and continuing through pelvis, torso, arms, shoulders, neck, and head. So that brings us to the present moment where I'm sitting here with you today.
Mm-hmm. Real honor to have you here, Rameen. Thank you for
Thank
sharing
you.
from the
You're
beginning.
very welcome. From the beginning.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Actually, I do want, it feels important to mention the beginning of the Yoga Sutras. Why don't we offer this right now? The first Yoga Sutra from Patanjali, Atha Yoga Nushasanam. Now
Yes.
begins the practice of yoga. It's a
Yes.
good time right now. It's an auspicious time to take a closer look at just what the hell we are doing as individuals. And well, there's good news. There's lots of maps for us to follow to bring us some direction and orientation. The second Yoga Sutra, Chittavritti Nirodha, yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations, the revolutions of a mind that keeps us separate and misperceiving what is really true and accurate. It's sort of an invitation to consider all the ways that we unenlighten ourselves. And I just wanted to offer that at the beginning to sort of maybe hold part of our conversation and even invite this listening to the folks that will be listening to this as a living, breathing consideration and contemplation for, well, I'll leave it at that for now. Rajive, I know you wanted to share something that was alive for you to continue to get the ball rolling here. Why don't you go ahead and do that?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think both you and Rameen bring up a very important point, and Rameen has mentioned it, and you've mentioned it as well. And so this type of wisdom that we're looking at now, and wisdom is very important because it's not random thinking that I just go with whatever's next in front of me, but it is systematic. And it is what Rameen just talked about, this evolution of him from the clouds through his journey with Pratapi Joyce over to the yoga loft and now into somatic living. And so this type of wisdom that is now exuding from this practitioner is this new orientation. We talk about, and he has often instructed myself in the current iteration of science, and this new orientation of science and technology is organic. The words are gentle, it's non-violent, and in his honor is elegant and beautiful. There's a certain elegance and a certain beauty in this science and technology. And so we talk about these methods, and then more importantly, superimposed on these methods is what is the necessary equipment that is required. So I'm going to give a quick analogy, and both of you know this analogy, but our listeners may not have. But I'd like to, if you can all just close your eyes for a minute and imagine a very large pasture in front of you. And these pastures are very extensive. And this is the fertile ground. And then on these pastures, you have these beautifully elegant and non-violent horses that are walking, sometimes running, sometimes just sauntering through these beautiful landscapes and beautiful pastures. Then you have this very gentle mind. The gentle mind is the reins. These are the reins that hold the horses back, just keeping them controlled, going in a direction that the practitioner wants them to go into. So not running around or not sauntering, but rather being controlled by the mind in a very gentle fashion. And then organically, there is reason behind the mind. This is the intention the intention of why we do anything that we do. And then finally, this entire sequence, the pasture, the horses, the reins, and then the charioteer, is called Ishvara Pranidhana, which is this entire existence of spirituality, where the practitioner knows that there is this voice or there is this journey that they are on to get closer to themselves. And the sutras talk about this, about how does the seer begin to look at themselves as they are practicing, and then becoming closer and closer to Ishvara Pranidhana. And so if you can open your eyes now, what I'd like to show you is that if you look at that chariot, and if you look at those reins, and if you look at that horse, and if you look at the pasture, this is entirely what goes on in our lives. So we have objects of desire. I have a Rolex, and this Rolex is sitting there in the pastures, just waiting for me to come and get it. The horses are the desires. I want that Rolex no matter what. And then the reins is my mind saying, oh, I better hold back because I don't have enough money to buy the Rolex. And then the reasoning, which is a charioteer, says, do I really need a Rolex? And if I get a Rolex, what does that really mean to me? And then the entire sequence of everything I just showed you is Ishvara Pranidhana, the decision that one individual makes to reason in their mind how they're going to control their senses towards these objects of desire.
Very simply put.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a lot of ways, what Dr. Jassal is saying is that everything is in this relationship of a conscious being that we have not yet been able to agree on what that conscious being is. But this conscious being has the full attention and fascination of every human being on this planet. And within that, there are universal laws that are governed beyond the thinking mind that gives us an opportunity to come closer to that experience, that conscious experience, and or further away from that conscious experience. And it is in the relationship of the decision maker with all of the tools that they have in front of them, with all of the experiences that they are engaging with, and their ability to make a decision that gives them the opportunity to rejoice in the bounty that is this Ishvara Pranidhana.
Mm-hmm.
And at its root, all experiences are this richness of bounty.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how we define it for ourselves, there is a learning that is occurring.
Mm-hmm.
And naturally, we become better at discerning what is that. How do we achieve that which is so subtle, but is profound within its strength?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if
In
we can
this,
make this a little more concrete in the relative human experience. So let's see, maybe a fundamental, here I am putting therapist hat on, or just a human, but there's objects of desire. People are longing for something, as Rajive pointed out. I also see it as, and work with a lot of people who are also terrified of things. There's objects of aversion to certain experiences and fears. And I've sort of distilled it down to sort of a fundamental perception. On the one hand, one perception that often many people are having is, life is against me. My curiosity, and I'll offer it to you both. The other perception is, well, actually, life is for me. I can feel into the personal and collective heartbreak of the chronic living in a space of life is totally against me. It kind of conjures for me, yeah, I mentioned a sense of heartbreak, but also to my mind, in part, it's kind of a victim-like consciousness, like I haven't chosen to be here. Why me?
It,
And so also it's my thinking, and just to offer this to see where this goes for us three here. The perception that life is against me leads to a constant state of self-contraction that is felt like a psychological cramping and emotional congestion and spiritual constipation. I'll offer that.
Mm.
And so I'm curious what you have to say on that, and I wonder what,
I'll briefly,
yeah, go ahead.
I'll briefly say that I think that your observation is correct, and that it seems to be both. It seems to be that the experiences that we're having as a collective is that life is against us, and at the same time, life is for us. It depends on how we are seeing it. It depends on the cleanliness of the lens.
Yes.
And it's not that one is right or one is wrong. It is arguably one is more pleasurable than the other. But what has led that individual, and I think this is what is really important, is what has led that individual to the place where they feel that life is completely against them. And then the teaching of how to work through whatever that is in order to now see the beauty and the bounty that is our reality, that it is actually for us.
Mm.
And then within that transformation is the truth that it is for us and not against us
Mhm.
constantly.
Mhm.
This makes me think about a very important idea. And in yoga, they talk about this with the Kundalini and the different parts of the mind being broken into different components. And both of you are speaking on this, which is this type of ahamkara, or what I like to call the curator. And if you think about most personalities that are formed, most personalities are formed by conscious and then subconscious. And we are now going to get into the psychology. So the conscious personality is like a sort of museum. And this is another analogy which I will give the podcast listeners, because this is a fantastic idea, which makes full sense, as my teacher would say, only once you've heard the idea. So the conscious personality is a sort of museum. The curator is the ahamkara. The ahamkara is a discernment. It selects objects for display to others from the museum's warehouse. This museum's warehouse is your subconscious. And everybody knows that the subconscious is so much more in regards to larger. And in fact, many of us don't have access to full subconscious. So these objects then, by the amakara, is taken out of the subconscious and it is actually placed into the exhibit hall. The exhibit hall is this personality that I am now consciously showing you, that my life is against me, or my life is perfect. Some exhibits, which are very popular, and this will bring some good conversation, I anticipate. Some exhibits which are very popular enjoy a longer run, while those exhibits which are patronized, either patronized by myself because of my inability to see myself as I truly am, because the lens, as Rameen talks about, is dirty or perhaps not as clean because it has not been refined with the tapas, is left with this murkiness. And then those exhibits are changed very quickly, not enjoying those long lasting popular exhibits that I want to show everybody. And then that's interesting, and I'm going to wrap it up with this final comment, is that with the ahamkara is the kundalini. And we can touch a base on the kundalini in just a few minutes or later in this podcast. But once the kundalini is awakened, and it will awaken in everybody at some point, you can wait for a life-changing event. You know, John is talking about, you know, how long are we going to wait? Am I going to wait till I have cancer? Or am I going to wait till I have a full breakdown and I'm depressed and I can't work? Or am I going to decide now that the conscious decisions that I'm making with my ahamkara are going to be for the best interest of my current iteration?
Mm-hmm. I like the tapas exploration in your in what you're saying. This willingness to see change as fuel to developing one's own personal practice, the practice of exactly that, polishing the lens, or transforming out of those exhibits which have been lasting a little bit longer than some that are maybe not as desirable as one would want. And that tapas has three modes of expressing itself. And John, I think that you have a lot more to say about this in the psychology realm, which I hope you can expound on. First is physical. So there's physical manifestation of this heat, this tapas expression, and it can come as a very pure heat moving through the body, or it could even go as far as some sort of an ailment. The second is mental, which would include emotional heat. So the perception of a challenge, or the brief but very strong anguishes that someone may feel emotionally or mentally. And the third is spiritual heat. So this could be the feeling of disconnection from some higher form of mind, or Ishwa Pranidhana, or the lack of feeling guidance, or just anguish in some realm. But if we can commit to that, if we can commit to the steadiness of those reins, which is the senses and the mind, and begin to see our effort as being worth it. The effort, the simplicity of the effort being worth it. And then how that effort, one small step at a time, begins to dissolve these patterned responses within the exhibits. And I'm interested to hear your point of view, John.
Mm-hmm. You know, whether it's in the context of teaching yoga, which the three of us teach yoga here, just mention that to the listeners, viewers, or for myself, when I have a therapist hat on, I find myself often putting myself in the shoes of other people. Could be called empathy. What's it like to live in your shoes? And even tuning in for this moment, in this present moment, if there's a listener listening right now, and I put myself in their shoes, I'm going, okay, what are we talking about here for real when it comes to where the rubber hits the road? And Rameen and Rajive have mentioned tapas, which is a word in yoga, which means heat, and among several other things, but also discipline, practices. We're also talking about the lens through which somebody is perceiving reality. This is a huge part of yoga, big time, but also the therapeutic psychotherapeutic world. And so that's where there's an intrigue for me, is where sort of spiritual practices, contemplative practices, concentrative practices meet the world of psychotherapeutic practices and techniques and strategies for what's the purpose? What's the goal? I actually want to offer a quote from Sri Dharma Mitra here. The goal of yoga, for example, is self-realization, to find out who you are and why you're here. Just want to offer that for a moment. So we've prefaced part of the conversation earlier with a perception that somebody can have at once, which is life is against me. The outer experiences, what's happening in the world, my own mind is against me, my emotions are against me, to the shift, that perhaps transformation in consciousness and perception, which is, whoa, life is actually for me. That's a monumental shift in perception for some, and can be potentially life-changing. So where I get curious, well, last little thing for now is, here we are talking about yoga. Rajive will have lots to say as well about neurology in the brain and brain chemistry. Talking about therapy, but the real human grit of it is, there's something wrong. There's something wrong in the world, or there's a perception there's something wrong with me. I need help. I'm struggling. I'm suffering. This is fucking hard. Life is really hard right now. I'm having a hard time seeing the way through. I'm going to pause for a second because I'm trying my best to make this really real. The human experience at times is really difficult.
That is really real. And before Rajiv goes into maybe some neurology of the whole beauty of what it is, the struggle is real. And it's the other side of the coin. So John, what you are expressing, I think that you see so many people who have this anguish is the actual grit that is causing the transformation. That without this level of the I am maker, that ahamkara piece, the ego component, without that part, there's no fuel in order to get to that higher state of consciousness within the base level of us as experiencers, because there's so much that we have been taught, because we are in learning. We are, as much as we are perfected in us coming into this world, we are equally learning as we're going along. But that doesn't mean just me and you as individuals, but that means generations after generation of learning. And that's why the traditions of wisdom exist. That's why science exists. That's why medicine exists, not as static, but as evolving bodies of work. And
This
we
is
are
amazing.
that body.
This is absolutely amazing. I'm feeling on this end of the universe, both of you, in great detail, and it's amazing. I'd like to just touch base on what Rameen just talked about, this idea about non-dualist, and this is a bit of Tibetan background. There will be a bit of a shift in the conversation, but then we will come back to it. But this idea that I have become and I am continuing to become, this idea that I am completed and that I'm continuing to complete. And so, without going into too much detail about the neuroanatomy, some anatomy is important here, that when we look at dopamine as the one chemical that is probably the most helpful here to understand what we're talking about, this idea about grit, meaning why should I care about doing this if I don't get some type of a reward afterwards. And this idea is brought out by dopamine. And dopamine is a neurochemical neurotransmitter that runs through the body. And many of us who use Instagram and TikTok, we get what we call phasic dopamine. We don't get tonic dopamine. Tonic dopamine would occur continuously after a long meditation, 20 minutes, or even listening to an hour and a half podcast on Reconcile. So the idea here then becomes over time is that the practitioner begins to recognize that there is a beauty in this tonic dopamine that is continuously being released rather than this phasic dopamine. And then once the reward center is stimulated continuously, the practitioner then recognizes, oh my God, I see the changes that are beginning to occur. And once these changes begin to occur, like Jon just mentioned, I see the way through, or I see that the world is no longer against me. This brings us into the second component of today's neuroanatomy lesson, which is the salient network. The salient network is formed of the insula and the cingulate gyrus. And this is very important. These areas of the brain right here allow the person to then form a concept image of themselves, which is what yoga is doing. We are working internally so that things that are occurring externally to us are being managed appropriately. And so this idea then is that I form this concept of myself based on what I am getting from everything around me, but also my internal dialogue with myself, my internal feelings. What am I exposing myself to? Am I exposing myself to ongoing social media, or am I now exposing myself to a nice walk around the neighborhood because I know that's good for me? So no longer is it about just saying, I'm going to go do that walk, but it's actually going and doing that walk and knowing that that is good for me, so I'm going to continue to do it. Taking ownership, again, of what is going around me. Wanted to offer that back to you, gentlemen.
The insula is one of my favorite parts of the brain. This interoception, proprioception, our ability to be aware of our environment on such a level that it creates networks of communication that is quicker than we could even think imaginable. And that our body posture changes in relation to that communication in order to sustain the communication. Now, within that, as the body posture, as we become aware of body and posture, we can have a direct link back into that nerve communication, interoception, proprioception relationship, and become now that much more conscious and aware via the breathing. This is now profound to me. I'm so happy that we touched upon it.
Yes, the insula is so important. And, you know, while we're talking about breathing, and Jon, you were talking earlier about some practicality to what we're doing. And, you know, we're sitting, we're meditating, we're doing postures, we're doing pranayama. And pranayama, for those listeners who may be novel to this idea, is one of the limbs of yoga. So one is asana, which is the posture. The second is pranayama, which is breath management or breath control. And then dhyana is the meditation. So when we talk about pranayama, this is a sequence of breath control, and prana, as many people have read about, is energy management. So the energy management in the nervous system is easily under voluntary control, which means you can control it simply by a simple set of exercises. These exercises have profound influences on the nervous system. So, for example, one is called sama vritti. Sama, same. Vritti, modifications. And in the beginning of this podcast, Jon had talked about the sutra that talked about the vrittis, which is the modifications of the mind. And this, of all pranayamas, is the simplest to do and is the most powerful of all pranayama practices. I teach it to all of my patients, my residents, and it's so easy. And to children love this pranayama. And as my teacher would say, please match every inhalation with every other inhalation, and please match every exhalation with every other exhalation. And it is that simple. And once the practitioner begins to recognize that they can carry this tool with them because they have their nostrils with them at all given times of the day, all you must do is practice. So you're getting into the car and you're a little bit pissed off because somebody just cut you off again. There you go, samavritti. You just got off the telephone with your wife and she was yelling at you again, samavritti. You're getting off a bus and you missed the connecting bus, samavritti. The idea then is by regulating the breath, we can then begin to regulate the nervous system, in particular the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation phase. And this is the one that is dominated by the insula. So the insula has great influences on the parasympathetic nervous system. So the idea then becomes is if a practitioner recognizes this, one would say, why are you not practicing samavritti all the time? Because then the idea then is you're making long-lasting changes in the nervous system that then the reactionary component is dampened. So that when you do get cut off in traffic or you do miss your bus or someone yells at you, you have a mechanism and a tool that can easily be called upon as long as you know how to practice it, which is simple because I just taught you that.
Mm-hmm. John, I think that you'd find this really interesting. Patabi Joyce would talk about asana and pranayama as being a physical postures and breathing as being the key components to all of the yamas and niyamas.
Mm-hmm.
So if done correctly, physical posture and breathing, and we can extend physical posture to us sitting here right now, the quality of our posture and the quality of our breath, and all of the yamas and niyamas are actually practiced naturally.
Yes.
And I do see that. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
I have a few comments on that, and I think it'd be helpful. Some listeners who may not have been as exposed to yoga would be helpful at some point. Maybe I'll comment on this here. Yamas and niyamas. They're listening. Maybe some of them like, what the hell is that? What are they talking about here? Little summary of what I heard Rajive mention, though. You gave I'm trying to bring it back to the concreteness of the human experience. So Rajive gave an example, which is a very common experience that is happening in the world. Well, at least the modern world anyway, the ease at which we can be so distracted and get these phasic dopamine hits, as Rajiv called them, doom scrolling, getting these hits. I'm finding in my work, if it comes up, and it has been coming up a lot in the therapeutic context, is people share that they're on social media and then they start to feel progressively shittier and shittier. And it activates a part of their psyche, and probably then, well, not probably, because we're integral beings, a part of the brain is getting activated that's creating this sort of negative self-talk. And they start beating themselves up and comparing themselves about what everyone else has. And the image, you mentioned image, so also really rich topic when it comes to yoga and svadhyaya, self-study, into the implications of having a healthy versus a not healthy self-image, and even transcending self-image in the first place. But the transition that I heard Rajiv mention from getting these temporary hits of dopamine and phasic dopamine hits to a more tonic, in my understanding, was a longer, sustained, focused attention, which I think this is where the richness of yoga and meditation come in, is to stabilize attention rather than getting these quick hits, temporary hits, and whatever that is in the sense of maybe other addictive, compelling behaviors. So I think that was a bit of a summary and sort of recontextualizing in a concrete way, an example through, the distractions of the world, perhaps planting a seed for why yoga, meditation, pranayama, breath work can be helpful to bring some semblance into the system. And then I think important here to just make a few comments on yamas and niyamas.
John, can I just put a quick pin in that before you get to the yamas and niyamas? So
okay.
Dr. Kristen Yont had just recently shared something really important with me, which is this gentleman called the Surgeon General of the United States of America,
Hmm.
whose job is to put out health advisories. And for the first time in the last 2 years, there have been health advisories that have been put out in regards to social isolation. But the second one was exactly what you were talking about, which is doomsday scrolling.
Hmm.
And this idea that the longer our children or ourselves spend on social media, and it's actually been shown in hours. So as it moves from 1 hour to 6 hours, the rate of depression, the rate of anxiety, and the rate of the person saying, I feel progressively shittier about myself
Yeah.
goes up. And
Yeah.
so the Surgeon General has actually issued a warning for the first time
Huh.
in 2023 about social media and its influence on the youth. So I
Whoa.
think your point is very well taken right now.
Huh. Yeah, I've heard this so many times in my psychotherapeutic practice and continue to. Um, and so here, bridge it into a map that is yoga that talks about, for example, the yamas and the niyamas. Let's make it real for people who are listening who haven't heard of that. And I'm open to being corrected, but let's keep it as simple as possible. Yamas and niyamas are, generally ethical observations, the things to consider to live a good life, a morally clear and emotionally clear life, which leaving it at that for now. So, ahimsa, satya, brahmacharya, asteya, aparigraha. These are the Sanskrit words, but non-violence, commitment to truth, satya, restraint or containment of one's energy, non-stealing or abundance, asteya, and aparigraha, non-possessiveness, non-attachment. The niyamas, these are saucha, santosha, tapas, svadhyaya, ishvara, pranidhana, just to give the Sanskrit words, but English, saucha, physical, mental purity. Santosha is contentment. Tapas is the self-discipline, the practices, the literal practices and the experience of heat. Svadhyaya, self-study or self-inquiry, and Ishvara Pranidhana, surrender or letting go, devoting to the higher self or the total context of one's pure awareness. So that was a lot, but these things to consider when the rubber actually hits the road, how they apply in someone's life. To take a moment and actually inquire. For example, let's give a few examples. How honest am I with myself and other people? Am I continually either lying to myself or deceiving myself and other people? What effect does that actually have on you? Aparigraha, non-attachment, non-possessiveness. Here, I'd be interested to hear what you might have to say around self-image, because this whole social media thing is playing into the self-images that people have about themselves, often a negative self-concept, and it's like fueling that, and it becomes addictive. So that's a whole topic. How about ahimsa, non-violence? What are the ways in which humans sort of beat themselves up in their own head? I'm not this, I don't have that, I don't have enough of this. It's sort of this scarcity-like mindset, creating what Gabor Mate talks about in his book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, a Buddhist metaphor, actually, these ghosts with huge bellies and they can't get filled. They're starving. What about svadhyaya, the willingness to take a closer look at oneself, self-study? What I find and discover in the counseling context and therapy is people haven't actually had the opportunity to learn how to self-inquire, or let alone have had the nurturing environments to think or feel that it's worth any value to do that. And so here we are. We're talking about sort of right conduct. How do I live a good life? Part of me, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of somebody doing the doom scrolling as we're on that tangent here. I know it's not really making me feel good. I'm doing this thing. It's like a habit. Maybe in yoga, we call that samskaras, laying down seeds of continual suffering. But there's another way. What's the other way? I'm just going to pause for a second. We threw a lot of concepts and ideas there. Any comments on that?
I think that an individual can go one whole lifetime of learning in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And all it takes is a moment of the right reflection to change that into a different mode of experience. And
Mm-hmm.
there's many ways of thinking about how an individual even gets to a place of achieving a higher mind and allowing that higher focal mind to observe the lower activities and start to discern what is good for us and what can now be sent away, and then how to get through what we're working on. So there's a lot. There's a lot to that. But in its simplicity, for me, it comes back to the opportunities that are surfacing more and more, like what Rajive was saying about the scrolling, around the support that our body, our breath, and our mind are worth much more than what we thought.
Mm.
And when we engage with them, the magical brick road emerges in front and we start to actually make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that might seem abstract, but at the same time, it's as concrete as humanly possible. But the missing component has been the support. But I think that the support is now starting, it's growing in vast numbers all over the world. Seeds have been planted in order to
Yes.
see the experience as something new.
Mm-hmm. I have
And it's even this.
go
Yeah,
ahead, Rajiv.
please, John. Yeah, and it's even this concept of the values. What we're talking about is that it is actually quite concrete because, if, like you're saying, John, somebody's coming to you and doesn't have a very well-established value system, and we know how important values are. In fact, if you just Google what are values, about 250 values come up. But when you distill it down to the majority of them are very similar to the niyamas and the yamas. And are these concepts about truth and honesty. And if you ask somebody what is really valuable to them, they all actually converge on about 8 or 10 of these value systems. And once we begin to recognize what our value system is, and from the value system go forward from there, this compass, this moral compass about what my body can do or cannot do, how I can breathe or how I cannot breathe, or how I can control the real estate of what I expose my mind to, whether that's TikTok videos that are 2 seconds long or a longer podcast that may provide greater levels of insight into thought and what I want to expose my brain to.
Hmm.
These are all very concrete ideas that we are putting forward for the audience that is listening today.
Yeah. Let's take this further, actually. So Rameen mentioned the value of the body, mind, breath is becoming more and more apparent as a culture. I think the seeds have been planted. I guess what I want to say on further on that is Rameen mentioned something about mode, the mode of perception. Here's, I think, could be a really unique bridge between the three spheres of our influence: neurology, psychiatry, medicine, yoga, meditation, contemplation, psychotherapy, psychology. Rajiv, you might be able to confirm this, but my personal senses, and I see it every day in my work, is, and teaching yoga, being a kinesiologist before and therapist, there's a physiology, which is to say a biology, to suffering. There's a physiology to shame. There's a physiology to guilt. There's a physiological felt sensational experience to cynicism, pessimism, skepticism, doubt, fear. Just as there's a physiological event and a breathing pattern that is unique to acceptance or joy or curiosity or confidence or assertiveness or aggression. So I want to just highlight here maybe as a bridge is like the direct lived human experience. We always have one nervous system and one body. And in either of these unique human experiences, say a cynical view of the world, which depending on the individual and personality, can stir sort of an inner mood of depression or like learned helplessness, for example, or pessimism. That outlook, this is where I'm curious. I think it might meld well as we sort of near the end of our conversation, but all of that physiology and that psychology is happening at the same time is influencing what we're seeing in the outer world and the inner world. Not only influencing what we're seeing, but then how we are reacting or responding. And this, I think, is where the interesting self-discipline in whatever way that looks, but we're talking about yoga, meditation, coming to see a therapist, or reading the right books, or listening to the right podcasts, the media diet. There's starting there to be a shift in the way somebody is thinking about how they're living. They're actually starting to look and feel, though. I guess I want to say as well, we need to feel the results of our chronic maladaptive thinking and feeling and the impact that that's having on our human experience. And my hope is, even just sharing this here to see if you two have something to comment on that. But my hope in sharing that is to invite the consideration that, for example, the listener, and I'm guilty of this at times too, the times of habitual negative self-talk that can come in, but to feel the result of that in my nervous system, for example, I'll use myself, creates a sort of reduction in vitality, or the shoulders round in. I'm fond of seeing this in my therapy practice and yoga, the shoulders rounding in, a repressed breathing posture, rather than a tall spine, hard out, head up. There's a postural awareness and an approach and an attitude approach to life. And there's a subtle difference there. And it's like, I want to say playfully here, it's like one breath away or one subtle shift in awareness away from the either direction there. Fundamentally, which is like a refusal, a restriction, or rejection of what is, to an acceptance and a welcoming and a hospitality of what is, and the vitality of life. I'll just leave it at that for now and see if you have any comments on that. Hopeful. My hope is that that's a bridge of some kind.
Lots to say. I think that to keep it simple, what comes to mind is armors that we wear
Yes.
within the body that mold and shape us in a particular mode of comfort that is often false, that allows us to believe that this is the world and our reality. And when we shift and become more in harmony with the world, so yama, or more in harmony with ourselves, niyama, then that gives us an opportunity to shift away from that particular mode of being and into something that is much, much more grounded in the present moment of now.
Hmm.
And I'm going to reiterate the preciousness of the lifetime of learning, like a body of work. There's a beginning and a continuation before there's the end. And I think to the ones who are listening, that as you were saying, is one breath away. So all of this that we're looking at in relation to yoga is one breath away. When we inhale, exhale, and we feel good, and we begin to realize at a level of understanding that every time we inhale and exhale, it's a good thing. That's good news into our being. It's very challenging. It's very hard to take a not good feeling breath. So that simplicity within the breath as it meets the body and it feels good, then begins to change the posture in very small, minute ways, but then becomes sustained, which then begins to shift from the rolling shoulders and the closed heart to the opened heart and the pulled back shoulder, which then begins to give access to the law of nature. We are all governed by something that we cannot see, but we all agree that something is there. Every animal, every insect, every plant, and every human is governed by. So the body of work is then the different stages of our development, and whether we see that as being painful or painless is depending on our particular experience. And the opportunity to move into something that is now new is one breath away. And the magic is when we are supported, and that's where this harmony with the world and harmony with ourselves, this whole yama and niyama, we must give ourselves an opportunity to change our environment. So whether that be put a plant in your room, or change the furniture around, or get away from those people that are influencing us in a particular way, the environment plays a huge role in so many things.
And I think this prediction that you talk about, John and Rameen, is very important. For those listeners who would like to dive deep, I would recommend you look up a lady named Lisa Barnett, Barrett, and she is very interesting. She's a neuroscientist who talks about this idea that the brain constructs your experiences as it predictively controls your body. So this is a very interesting concept, because what Ramin is talking about is very important, that if I'm surrounded by statues of Shakti and a small little Buddha statue on my left, that's going to affect my nervous system, and it's going to predict about how I do control my body, so that if I look back at him and he's sitting in a very calm, peaceful, upright posture, so will I. And this is as easy as her lesson is. Her lesson is that the brain and the body are such incredibly predictive organs that even before you think you're thirsty, 10 hours before, your body was already doing the necessary things. It was getting a water bottle, it was beginning to fill glasses of water around you, and it was making you get closer and closer. You thought you were just thirsty at that time, but your body and your brain had predicted that 10 hours ago. And so, very similarly, she says that as a result of this, we can have significant influence not only on our thoughts, but on our emotional body. And so, if we were to wrap it up and bring it back to this idea that, the world is against me, it is then against you. If you're creating situations which are progressively in that mindset that you don't have enough time, you're not creating enough time, you're filling your schedule up with one meeting after another meeting, your nervous system has no ability to do anything except to be reactionary. And then you move from one reactionary event to another reactionary event. But instead, if you begin to recognize that I do actually have control over this small little space that I'm in, and I'm going to get rid of all the chairs, and I'm going to put a yoga mat on the ground. So every time I get out of bed, I see it. I can think about maybe doing something about what I want to do to change. Then you can certainly make those types of changes. So she's quite an interesting researcher, and we can talk about her another time. But Lisa Barrett, and she talks about this idea about the body's and the mind's prediction modeling. And this prediction modeling is without fail because the brain has been developed so detailed in its physiology. And when we talk about the insula and we talk about introspection and proprioception, I could, for example, just show the listeners a video of two towers skipping. And this is what she shows in the video. She shows two towers skipping. And immediately when you watch the video, you're brought back to when you were a kid and you were playing jump rope with somebody. Yet the picture makes no sense because it's two big towers that are swinging with a skipping rope. But yet, because our mind and because our brains are so predictive, we automatically substitute things into those types of experiences. So this idea about a plant around you, or this idea about maybe not listening to the radio on the way to work and maybe just having a moment of silence for yourself or quiet for yourself, has long-lasting effects on the nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
This stirs, when you mentioned change, actually, and like prediction, you know, it, for me, it stirs for a moment of pondering and a reflection on the human experience of habits. And some habits are, you know, health inducing, and some habits are maladaptive. We have habits of thought, habits of feeling, habits of posture, certain habits of what we bring into our system or not, so forth. But the change process in general, it's almost like part of what this podcast is even about, is reconciling opposites, reconciliation within social and cultural institutions and collective thinking patterns and how that all looks. But in the individual, I want to bring it to a really important piece that yoga talks about, aparigraha, back to aparigraha, non-attachment or letting go. I wonder if you have either of you have a comment to make or thoughts on the process, and actually even want to invite you to bring your own personal experience in if you wish to. But I'll preface that invitation for a moment and put myself in the shoes of fellow listeners, fellow, you know, yoga practitioners or potential beginners to yoga and therapy clients who are engaging in an attempt to be more involved in a change process. And they're really confronting these habits of being, habits of interpretation, habits of thought, certain unconscious beliefs. My observation is, and personal, is something needs to be let go of. Something has to die almost so that you can become or adopt new ways of being, new ways of seeing, new behaviors, new ways of thinking, so forth. So I want to invite you, whether your own, you know, reflections on working with people or your own lived experience of maybe minor or major sort of life events where you recognize like, shit, this way I'm living isn't working and I need to make a change. This has to be let go of because like, yeah, there's much more I can say on that. I feel that in my own bones, blood and breath at times where I've had to do that. If we want to get even more nuanced, it's actually happening in every single moment in a micro level, but more on like the relative human plane when it comes to the change process and letting go so that you can become who you're becoming, you know. Any thoughts on that?
I think that it is an ongoing procedure, this aparigraha, and key fundamental to the human experience. And this ability, like as you were saying, to hold things so very lightly, because we are in a pattern of learning more than anything.
Mm.
So that means that we don't know. We do not have all the answers. So therefore, we must look very closely at all things that are happening and all of our actions that we're doing and weigh them out carefully to say, is this actually correct?
Mm.
And then take it one step further and establish a self-reliance within it all in relation to discernment, so that then I am not a collection of that which I have been inundated with by the socials or the environment or the past, but rather I am actually what is occurring within this present moment now.
Mm.
And to me, that is an everyday. And I've had big learnings within that, where, like what you were saying, this holy shoot department, where you're like, okay, something has to change right now. And I've had smaller learnings in this department where I can say, okay, I can see my course of life, and now I can make this change, and then it will actually become brighter and that much more sweet. And that's a dexterity that is a gift. And
Mhm.
if one has acquired that ability of self-inquiry and analysis, then that's precious and they should honor it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Rajive, any comments on that one?
Yeah, I think this container that we have can only handle a certain amount. And so I think the Abari Gaha is really important, letting go of something that is no longer serving you. I have been a long-standing practitioner of neurology, and I myself have made a number of changes to my practice. And this idea about my container being too full, and a very smart individual in my life one day, Nancy, had told me, you know what, Rajiv? If you need more room in your container, you need to let some stuff go. And I remember that distinct conversation because then I began to make the necessary changes so that I could then begin to look into physician wellness, physician burnout, explore other avenues of my life that I could bring the beauty and the elegance of my neurology to. And it is certainly less clinical, certainly less financially rewarding, but the swadhyaya, or my own self-study in this, has become profound. And in many ways, I think that this has allowed me then to have a richer life and be able to, explore things that Rajiv wanted to explore for so many years, but always had excuses and always made excuses as to why I couldn't do it.
Mhm.
And it was not financial, it wasn't anything other than myself and me just saying, okay, now is the time that is right for me. And so this
Mm.
discrimination takes time too. This idea about how do I refine my ahamkara enough that I can then make the right decision in my life so that I can then move into the space. I obviously don't want to starve. I obviously don't want to lose my mortgage or my car, but this is not as important. The getting back to the Rolex at the end of the pastures, it's not as important as maybe it once was in my eyes previously.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah. I'll share a quick example actually of a pretty profound insight that I experienced within the last 2 years. And in brief, what it was, as has become evident in this conversation or those who listen to the podcast, that I work as a therapist. It's a hat that I wear. And I had this profound experience, quite a revelation was one night where it was a holy shit moment. And it was a thought that came in, I don't have to be a therapist anymore. That thought came in after a profound purging experience, profoundly being brought to my knees in a grief process, a catharsis. This is a potent example of a letting go. I would call this a bigger letting go than the little ones. And, you know, after many months of digesting that experience, I came to recognize what it meant was, because I'm still working as a therapist. In fact, I'm really enjoying my work. It didn't mean literally to stop being a therapist. I came to understand that it showed me deeply an element of my past conditioning where I became, quote unquote, I became a therapist when I was really young in my family of origin, for example. And my makeup was I became the peacekeeper in my environment. And, from a psychological nervous system perspective, a stress response, we might call that the fawning response, keeping peace at all costs, becoming the placater, uh, trying to keep matters as stable and friendly as possible in an environment that maybe actually wasn't really stable. The realization of I don't have to be a therapist anymore for a moment was, oh, I'm doing the therapist thing and trying to just keep everybody happy and good. It even was showing up in my yoga teaching. Don't challenge people too much. You'll risk losing this identity that became this person who keeps everyone happy. Well, I just want to say that doesn't fucking work. That program, that program had to die. And for a time, it was crippling for me to feel into there's a cost. Anyone listening to this one, and I work with some people who live that program, the people-pleasing fawning program, coming to terms and reconciling with the profound cost and price that you've been paying to live from that program, that mode, that way of seeing the world and yourself is a profound diminishment to oneself and the people around you. And now I've been seeing how I can even feel that aliveness and fire right now in talking about it, is it shows up now in the way that I work as a therapist and a yoga teacher, where the learning was, if I were to try to be as succinct as I can here in this moment to complete it, would be something like believing in the sufficiency of each human individual, that they are able to not only able, but have the right to be themselves and the right to grow. And from the more personal experience, I don't have to control or worry about them. There was a significant distinction between, making sure everyone's happy and okay, and the people-pleasing response to, oh shit, an oh shit moment. Like, no, you're fully sufficient and complete as you are. Well, let's get to work from that place. And there's more I could say to stretch that further, but I want to pause for a second to see if there's any. I saw a few nods from you as I was sharing elements of that share, and curious if it stirred anything for you.
I think the sufficiency that you talk about is really, really important, that, in its entirety, mankind and womankind is sufficiently capable.
Mm.
And it gets back to this idea that as we wear these different roles of yoga teacher, yoga master, psychologist, neurologist, whichever hat you decide to put on, the bottom line is that you've refined your lens, you've refined your ahamkara. And as a result of your sustained practice, it is then only possible for you then to pass these tools, these techniques to these patients or to these people that are already sufficient. And so all that then is required is to show the necessary path and then Ishvara Pranidhana.
And to be bold. I think as bold as one can be,
Mm.
growth and development. Like as you were sharing, the bolder you've become, the clearer the path has been. And I think that that's very important to all the listeners to take oneself in a playful way, seriously,
Mhm.
and the learning that we have engaged in, and the opportunity that we have in order to um, be that much more refined and clear.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Because it does work. This Swadhyaya, this self-study, all of it, it works.
Mhm. Well, actually, in our last podcast, Rajive mentioned that svadhyaya, self-study, the literal willingness to look at oneself is the medication.
Yes,
That
that's
was
an
a,
excellent one.
yeah, that was a punchline from last time. And
Excellent.
you know, so I think we're going to start to wind this down here, but the topic of values came up, and I want to just suggest, even here, whether you're listening or us here, this three of us, whether or not anyone ever listens to this thing, we human beings in any moment are living a value. Any action, anything we're up to, there's a value behind it. If we're doom scrolling, the self-study is okay, fine, you're doom scrolling. Are you aware of what you're choosing? Are you aware of the value behind that? There's a value behind doing that. Just like there's a value to us talking about what we were talking about, or sitting down to meditate, or listening to a neurologist talk about certain things about the brain and the effect on the nervous system, to we sit down and do some writing about what's alive for us in life, or choosing to inquire into the effect that my, um, you know, feeling like I'm living in guilt all the time. What's that about? Choosing to look at that rather than to push it away, there's a value in there. I just wanted to offer that, and that there's certain values, there's attitudinal values, certain attitudes we live by have a value to them. I kind of mentioned briefly before, like an accepting attitude, or a cynical attitude, or an attitude of compassion, or in Sanskrit, maitri, unconditional friendliness, or compassion, so forth. There's creative values, the kinds of things we like to engage in. And, uh, well, a quote coming through right now from Dr. Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a neurologist actually himself, who survived 4 concentration camps during Nazi-occupied Germany. Quite a story. Highly recommended book. But there's a quote from there. It's pretty famous, and it has to do with attitude. And he says, the last of the great human freedoms is man's, woman's, human's ability to choose one's attitude in a given situation. The ability to choose one's attitude in a given situation is the last of the great human freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
That's coming from a man who's in the middle of hell on earth at the time, where there was a 1 out of 23 survival rate of the human beings in these camps. And so as we start to wind this conversation down, I'm resonating on the topic of and value of what it takes to really examine or look or investigate, excuse me, into the choices that we are making in any moment, any minute, any day, month, and the power, the significance, and the role of that awareness that it has. So it's almost the topic of choice. I
Yeah,
wonder
first
if
is the
this.
value of being alive. I think there's a huge value in being alive.
Mhm.
Just the simplicity of eyes open, looking around, and then the value of our ability to make choice. And I go back to the fact that we as humans are learning, and we are learning the value of having choice. There's many great teachers and bodies of work that are coming forth that are teaching the value of choice. And I think the more we begin to understand the value that we have within our choice, the choices begin to change and become more purposeful. And within that purpose, then we begin to change as individuals, which then begins a cascading effect of positivity, which is then pluralized and strengthened as we become more and more established as a tipping point, like a critical mass of people who are beginning to see the value that they have just by being alive and aware. And that is happening. I see it. I see it happening every day. It's happening here in New York, walking around in Brooklyn. You see people and the way that they interact, and because of the density of population, you have to interact in a certain way, or else it would be chaos. And the kindness that comes through, and the choice of words that are being made, and the choice of slowing down to allow someone to go in front of you, it's heartwarming. I see it constantly. It's happening more and more and more and more and more. The values are changing. Even though there is strife, the values are changing.
And I thank both you gentlemen because, you know, this idea about clarifying your values is really important, right? You know, once we start to ask ourselves, you know, what is bringing me joy, santosha, and what has brought me joy in the past, meaning what have I achieved and what do I hope to achieve in the future? And then it, you know, allows the clarifications. And then how does this value per se have to do with the fabric of my existence? Meaning, how am I going to be in this world going forward? Am I going to take another minute and let that person go in front of me? Or am I going to pause and let somebody speak on the podcast rather than rushing in to get my point across all the time? And then this balance begins to occur as we settle into the body, settle into the mind. And then, you know, hopefully we become better people as we're beginning this long journey ahead of ourselves.
I think Rameen sort of brought to life a little bit there the other category of values, which is experiential values. Throughout, and that's where I think a nice bridge is through the practice of yoga, for example, or meditation or mindfulness or seeing a therapist or whatever practices you're engaging in. As you start to discover the value to those practices, it becomes an experiential value. You realize, you recognize, oh, I'm doing this because I actually like to do it. If there's value, there's worth to it. And it becomes not just a cognitive mental idea, like I should do that thing, but because it's an expression of realization and actualization of your values that are important to you. For example, practicing yoga, asana, physical practices, breath work, and meditation. You try it out, you go and you recognize, oh, it actually feels good. Like every layer of my being, there's something good here for me. It's an experiential value. Also awakens in me these attitudes, which is the literal approach that we take to ourselves in life. Like, for example, kindness to others, but it starts to turn towards you. Start to be more kind to yourself. The mind becomes more user-friendly rather than chronically self-berating and diminishing. And so, yeah, this moment of choice that we have right here. Also, as Viktor Frankl says, at any moment, man, woman, human must decide for better or for worse what will be the monument of their existence. And between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is freedom. The freedom to choose. This isn't art, though. This is something that's an art within therapy, counseling, psychotherapy. I wonder if you see resonance here. Part of the goal of a therapist, if there is a goal, just there is to support people to coming to recognize for their own self, what's the right thing here for me? Reconciling. As a yoga teacher, trying to empower and encourage students to connect with their own inner teacher. What's the most important thing here for me? This is the piece around authority, to stand with oneself in their own authority rather than continually pushing it away. I think in part is the part of a goal of yoga to offer a definition of enlightenment from spiritual teacher Anthony DeMello. Enlightenment is absolute cooperation with the inevitable. As Adyashanti says, this is simultaneously both the definition of and the activity of enlightenment, enlightened behavior. Cooperation, rather than constant chronic self-refusal of what's really present right now. Cooperating with the totality of one's direct experience. This is the experiential wisdom. Atma Anubhava in yoga. The experience that one is informed by the totality and is at once the same and one with that. This is profound. It's exciting
Profound.
times.
Very.
I'll breathe into that.
Yeah, thank you. I was just breathing into that space that you had just created. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you.
Why don't we finish with a couple of concluding, what are we leaving with from this conversation? What do we want listeners to know? What's alive for you personally? You know, if we just take off our hats for a moment and be just fully human and real in this present moment, what are we leaving from this conversation, having this opportunity to connect, which we'll never have the same opportunity again. It's always different. What's this all
For
been
me, it's
about?
the continuation of a continuation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a profound opportunity to expand my mind on the topic of being alive. And again, an opportunity to take the information into my own personal practice and apply it. And I think that every moment is this, and to have time and space with individuals such as yourself. It happens hopefully as regularly as it can for everybody. And it's an honor. It's an honor to talk about the topic of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So application and the continuation of the continuation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's the reframing and then the reframing of ourselves. This idea about Hatha yoga. How do I reframe and then reframe and then reframe myself? As my teacher would say, mere philosophy will not satisfy us. Without practice, there is nothing. But with practice, there is everything. And only with practice can you achieve. And this is why, in many ways, the sutras and Patanjali and the 8 limbs of yoga are so important in this time period, because there is this method on how do I reframe, and then how do I reframe, and then how do I continue to practice with tools that are so ancient yet so modern, and the application is so simple as long as I do it. And my teacher always reminds me that you either do it or you don't want to do it. And this resonates very strongly to myself right now, in this idea that I must do it. And if I don't, then there's a part of me that is saying, I don't want to do it. And I have to look at that. And I have to look as to, why does that part of me say that I don't want to do it? Is it fear-based? Is it, and in many cases, it is fear-based. I'm somewhat afraid of something that is not real. And if I'm living life and I want to live life to the fullest of my abilities, then I must face my fears and move through them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, something I'm taking away from this conversation, I'm feeling both honored and humbled to have the opportunity to connect in this way and to share in such a rich dialogue that's lively and multidimensional, in the sense of, I think what we're drawing on here in an integrated way, and why I think the practice of yoga, for example, is so rich, is it draws on our multiple intelligences. It's not merely conceptual, disembodied philosophy, but it's easy to take that route. It's applied wisdom. It's applied philosophy with a method and techniques and strategies in a direction that moves one towards alignment and harmony with life. It's the definition of yoga. And with that, as Rameen mentioned, and the takeaway, it's somewhat conceptual, but you feel it. You start to feel into the truth of this somatic, direct experience of these teachings, in the sense that, you feel the result of becoming honest with yourself and other people. You feel the result of being kind to others and yourself, just like you feel the opposite when the mind is completely, berating oneself. You feel the result of that. We feel that. Just like when embodying the practice of self-study and truly having the willingness to look at oneself and transform. But also, how about this for humility? The willingness to be wrong about the conclusions that I've continually been making about life outside and other people and myself. How's that for a potential shift in consciousness? I've been so on my high horse. Let's bring the chariot thing back in. I'm on the high horse of the chariot, surrounded in Rolexes, and I'm in my righteousness. I'm right, and my thing is about being right all the time. And the discovery of, oh shit, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm willing to be wrong. There's an effect at these small or big realizations, and I think we start to feel what happens for us when we come into alignment with the correct discipline. As Rameen has said before, we come to the right discipline for ourselves through our self-study. I'm paraphrasing, but I've really appreciated that. That's become something that I share with my own self, but classes is, it's a personal process, and it's full-bodied, like John Kabat-Zinn, full catastrophe living. All levels of our intelligences.
Yes.
All parts. It all belongs.
And it's so sweet.
Well, any final comments, or did we nail it there?
I think this is it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope that well, like myself, coming away with this, just feeling enriched. I feel enriched by the topic of conversation and connecting with you, and closer to you both, closer to life and myself. And I hope that some of the topics that we talked about have been stirring for some people, maybe awakening. Maybe that's too audacious to say, but stirring something
Mhm.
All right. Well, take good care, both of you. What an honor again to sit with you, and take care, everyone else out there. Thanks for listening and tuning into Reconcile. And yeah, I think we should do this again sometime. I'm going to plant that seed.
Definitely. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Take good care. Bye.